There was a tense silence in the courtroom. A black female attorney was confidently presenting her case to the jury. The judge, an older man with a cold, distant gaze, suddenly interrupted her. His tone was laced with hidden contempt, and he clearly did not take her words seriously. The courtroom froze, and the jurors looked at each other. A barely noticeable expression of anger flashed across the attorney's face, but she quickly pulled herself together. Despite the obvious attempt to humiliate her, she stood with her head held high and continued her presentation as if nothing had happened. Keeping all her emotions in check, she directed her attention to the jury, continuing to present her case with clarity and confidence. A storm raged inside her, but outwardly she remained calm. Her every gesture, every word was precise and verified. Suddenly, everything changed. Her next move was so unexpected that the courtroom literally froze in shock. No one could believe that she dared to do this. And now, dear viewers, let's take a break for a minute. Write in the comments where you are watching this video now. What do you think about this case? What would you do in her place? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the continuation of this incredible story. Enjoy watching. The courtroom was tensely silent. Defense attorney Nia Williams stood before the jury, her voice firm but calm. Her entire demeanor radiated a confidence that she thought would keep her in control of the situation. But with each passing second, she felt Judge Walter Stanton's gaze pressing down on her. The white man looked down on her with a clear sense of superiority, as if her achievements, education, and work meant nothing to him. Nia knew she had a tough job ahead of her. Her client's defense was not easy, but she had faced many difficult cases over the years and always emerged victorious. This time, however, it was more than just a legal matter. It was a direct challenge to her as a black woman in a world where prejudice still reigned. She knew she had to be clear and confident in her words, but as she spoke her first sentence to the jury, Judge Stanton cut her off. He made a sarcastic remark about her ability to interpret the law with an icy grin, as if to imply that she didn't belong here, that her knowledge and experience were worthless compared to his authority. A hushed murmur of discontent swept through the courtroom, but no one dared to object. Nia felt a lump of hurt and anger lodged in her throat. Her hands shook, but she held herself back, not letting herself lose. Her mind flashed back to the time she had been forced to endure humiliation simply because her skin was a different color. She couldn't afford to lose. The judge continued to humiliate her, this time openly laughing at her questions for the witness. He spoke slowly, emphatically, as if addressing a child who did not understand. The jurors watched silently, hesitant to intervene. Nia made eye contact with several of them, and in their gazes she saw confusion and sympathy, but not support. It was like a slap in the face. And then, like a sudden storm, her determination entered a new phase. The inner fire that had always been within her flared up with new strength. She paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. Her voice, now steely, cut through the silence of the room. Each word carried the strength of generations who had to fight for their place in the world. She spoke not only for herself, but for all those who had ever been humiliated for the color of their skin, who had faced injustice simply because they did not fit into someone else's standards. She wasn't defending herself, she was defending the truth. Nia began to expose the inconsistencies in the judge's arguments, not allowing his sarcasm to throw her off course. Her words were dead on target, calling into question not just his remarks, but the very foundation of how he was conducting the trial. The courtroom began to sense a shift where the judge had seemed so unshakable before. His arrogant mask was beginning to crack. Each new comment Nia made was backed up by facts, backed up by a truth that couldn't be ignored. The judge tried to interrupt her again, but this time her voice was louder. She didn't let him stop her. Nia could finish her speech. The judge cut her off again, raising his hand as if giving a command to a servant. His voice, icy and full of irritation, sounded like a sentence. He loudly and publicly declared that her behavior was unacceptable and unprofessional. His words echoed around the room, as if the world's court had finally decided her fate. He emphasized that some people needed to be reminded of their place, eliciting a low chuckle from someone in the audience. It was a moment when a cold, tangible wave of humiliation hit her in the face. Nia felt the eyes on her. The jurors looked away, heads down, as if ashamed of her. The court spectators grinned, enjoying the spectacle. as if they had been waiting for this moment, eager to see the fall of the one who had dared to rise above what was permitted. But worst of all, she knew she was alone. Her words, her brilliant defense, all erased by one small, humiliating gesture. Nia stood silently, holding back tears, her head held high, even as pain seethed inside her. She remembered her mother telling her as a child that in this world they would have to work twice as hard and endure twice as much to be accepted. Her warnings had always seemed harsh to Nia, but now they were reality. The judge didn't see her as a person. To him, she was just another black woman who dared to step outside the box he and society had set for her. He didn't stop there. As if to crush her further, Stanton called a bailiff and demanded that Nia be immediately ejected from the courtroom for disturbing the peace. Her objections, her rights, all were ignored. She was ejected like a criminal, her hands sliding over the empty space where her papers lay, as if even that no longer mattered. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she refused to let them spill, refused to let them become further evidence of her weakness. At the door, she glanced back at the room full of people watching this spectacle. Some were openly mocking, some were watching her humiliation with indifference, but no one stood up to defend her. The cold wind hit her face as she was pushed outside. It was as if nature itself was mocking her weakness. Nia stood frozen on the steps, unsure of what to do next. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for her entire life, had been shattered in an instant. She knew it would make headlines. Black lawyer makes scene in court. Her name would be etched in the shame, and she would become a symbol of how injustice had defeated yet another person who had tried to make a difference. Nia felt a wave of despair wash over her. The judge's words, full of arrogance and contempt, echoed in her mind, as did the memories of the times she had been told she would never be good enough. She saw how the door she had been thrown through represented not just this particular court, but an entire system that had held her people captive to injustice for years. But the worst was yet to come. She couldn't go home, couldn't look her family in the eye, who believed in her. She couldn't explain to them why truth hadn't won, why justice was just a mask for those at the top, deciding whose lives mattered. All her dreams now seemed like phantoms. Deep down, she knew this wasn't just a loss, it was the collapse of her belief that she could make a difference in this world. Nia stood in front of the courthouse, helplessly watching her life fall apart. Dark clouds gathered over the city, as if reflecting her inner state. Nia wandered through the shadows of the evening streets, her steps slow and uncertain. The city that had once seemed vibrant and full of possibilities now seemed dark and oppressive. Every word the judge said, every taunt from the audience tore her apart. She tried to regain some composure, but the dark thoughts and sounds from the courtroom would not let her rest. On the sidewalk, she came across a group of young men loudly discussing the news. As Nia approached, one of them, noticing her tired face, said loudly, "And there's that lawyer who decided to play with the big boys." Apparently, she couldn't stand the pressure. The words were full of contempt and mockery. She tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. Someone else's humiliation, so recently forced upon her, seemed to continue. Nia quickened her pace, but soon the police caught up with her. One of the officers, looking at her battered face, said that she was being detained for indecent behavior in a public place. The police officer's gaze was cold and unfriendly, clearly waiting for an opportunity to remind her of her place. Nia didn't know what to do. She tried to explain that she just wanted to go home, but every protest she made only made things worse. Her hands behind her back, she felt her freedom slipping away from her again. It seemed like the whole world was against her. She was eventually taken to the police station, where she was not only photographed and fingerprinted, but also subjected to humiliating interrogation. They weren't interested in her case, they were interested in showing that her rebellion would not go unpunished. Nia was shocked at how her life was instantly transformed into a carnival performance for those who wanted to see her humiliated and broken. Her time in the police station seemed endless, but she was finally released, leaving her with a disgraced reputation and uncertain prospects. She found herself back on the streets, her eyes tired and aching, searching for any light in the gloom. Her mind was filled with questions, but there were no answers. Her law license was suspended pending an investigation, and the next day, headlines about her uncontrollable behavior were already appearing in the newspapers. Returned home, she found her home the center of attention. Reporters, paparazzi, and the curious had arrived. They surrounded her, pushing and shoving, asking questions she couldn't answer. It was like a scene from a nightmare, where she was just an object of discussion, not a person with real feelings and emotions. Every new flash of a camera and every new word seemed like the final nail in her coffin. Nia felt her world crumbling. Images of her family, her mother, who she could never disappoint, floated into her mind, and every time she tried to lift her head, she was knocked down again and again. The situation became more and more confusing and overwhelming, and her situation seemed hopeless. Under the weight of what had happened, Nia felt a growing sense of hopelessness. Meanwhile, journalists and reporters soon began spreading rumors about her alleged inappropriate behavior and that she was trying to stage a scandal to attract attention to herself. Every day brought new accusations and exaggerations, and each new report became a cause for public condemnation. Eventually, her persecution began to affect her personal life. People in her neighborhood began to avoid her. Her friends began to cautiously distance themselves, fearing that association with Nia could negatively affect their own lives. Only those who were willing to support her no matter what remained in her life, but even their moral support could not completely ease her suffering. Nia found herself in a bind where she had to deal with the personal, social, and professional consequences of her fight for justice. Her dream of a just society seemed distant and unattainable. She felt betrayed by a system that cast her as a victim. Every day, when Nia looked in the mirror, she saw not just her reflection, but also the entire burden of betrayal and injustice that had become her new companion. Her inner turmoil and struggle seemed to have reached its peak, and now she could only gather the strength to continue her path in the darkness, hoping that sooner or later the light would break through the fog. When Nia took to the streets again, the reality of her new situation hit her with even greater force. The city that had once seemed like a place of opportunity now felt like hostile territory. Every look, every word she heard confirmed her fears. She was no longer just a lawyer fighting for justice. She was now a symbol of failure and betrayal by a system that had betrayed her because of the color of her skin. In the weeks following the incident, Nia found her reputation continuing to deteriorate. The business offers that once came her way from across the country disappeared. She stopped receiving invitations to legal conferences and seminars. Even her peers in the professional community began to avoid her, fearing that associating with her would negatively impact their careers. These changes were not just a blow to her professional life, but also a reminder of how deeply ingrained society's prejudices are. Her environment became a place of constant stress and suspicion. When Nia tried to go to work, some places simply wouldn't serve her. Stores and restaurants that used to know her by name now refused to serve her without explanation. Friends and coworkers she was close to began to avoid her. They may not have even realized it, but every gesture or word they made was a reminder to Nia that her racial identity was now perceived as a negative factor. One day, when she tried to enter a local cafe, she was pushed away from the door and the waitress, with barely concealed mockery, told her that the establishment did not serve customers with unacceptable behavior. Nia, feeling tears welling up on her cheeks, walked away, unsure of where to go. Suddenly, she realized that her name had become a byword for discrimination and prejudice, as if her personal shortcomings or mistakes were a projection of her entire racial group. People on the streets were also becoming more hostile. Nia felt their eyes gliding over her, as if they were immediately determining her status, her belonging to those who were out of place. The court incident and the events that followed had spread across social media, and even when she tried to speak out against the false rumors, her messages were ignored or distorted. People with whom she had once discussed important matters were now active participants in discussions about her scandalous reputation. One day, while Nia was walking down the street, she was stopped by an older man who began yelling at her, accusing her of representing all black people poorly. Her attempt to explain that her personal matter had nothing to do with the entire race was cut short by his rude interruption. The attack, although verbal, was so painful that Nia felt her strength finally draining away. In that moment, she realized how hard it is to be a lone voice in the fight against systemic racism when that voice is being trampled under a mass of preconceived notions and prejudices. The situation became so critical that Nia began receiving anonymous threats. The pieces of paper sent to her home contained aggressive, racist comments and wishes. Her home became the object of constant surveillance by prying eyes, making her feel unsafe even in her own home. Nia realized that this was not just a personal attack, but part of a larger campaign of hatred aimed at convincing her that she had no right to her place in society. At the same time, the social and professional institutions that had previously promised protection and support now seemed to her to be modestly distancing themselves from her. None of her complaints or requests for help were given the attention they deserved. The system that was supposed to protect her was indifferent and uncaring. Deep down, Nia still struggled with the hope that justice and compassion would ultimately prevail. But each day brought more evidence that racism was not easy to overcome. It permeated every crack in society, and had to be fought not only in the arena of justice, but in every aspect of one's personal life. Amid these internal and external pressures, her desire for justice was tested, and she continued to search for a way to find light in the impenetrable darkness that had enveloped her life. Nia found herself in the middle of a social and personal storm where racism was at every turn. To make matters worse, society continued to perpetuate her bias and misconceptions as someone undeserving of respect. Every day of her life was a struggle for survival, and every night was a darkness filled with fear and betrayal. One evening, as Nia was returning home after trying to find a job, she was once again surrounded by reporters. They, as before, attacked her with endless questions and requests for comment, but now their aggression was even more noticeable. They clearly enjoyed her suffering and mocked her situation. One of the reporters, holding a camera in Nia's face, asked jokingly, "What is it like to be the face of a new racial stereotype?" These words cut deeply, as if to the core of her existence. As the pressure mounted, Nia began to feel her personal boundaries disappear. She could no longer distinguish between her reflection and how others saw her. Her every move and action was questioned and criticized. People she had previously been able to interact with without fear now took her as an example of the shortcomings of all black people. She was constantly under scrutiny, and every move she made was met with a dose of judgment. One day, Nia received an invitation to a meeting organized by a human rights organization. She finally felt that she would find support and understanding. However, when she arrived at the meeting, she was met with hostility. In the meeting room, those present, although attentive to her stories, were clearly wary of her. Some participants clearly doubted her motives and sincerity. Amidst the mistrust and discontent, her position again seemed vulnerable. As tensions mounted, Nia began to notice how some of the organizations and public figures who had once supported her were distancing themselves from her. They pretended that her cause was irrelevant to their values. This betrayal, coming from those who would have been her allies, was especially painful. Every rejected offer of collaboration, every ignored plea for support, reminded her that her struggle was not just being ignored, but being distorted and trampled. Meanwhile, a wave of racist abuse began to rage on social media. Anonymous users wrote offensive comments, claiming that her recent behavior was the result of her natural inappropriate behavior. She became the target of crude jokes and racist memes that spread relentlessly among internet users. These insults, initially abstract, were now becoming part of her daily life, and she found that they were not only hurting her, but also threatening her mental health. Nia developed symptoms of an anxiety disorder. She became afraid to leave her house and often woke up in a cold sweat at night from nightmares in which she was being pursued by unknown forces. Her condition worsened, and she spent more and more time alone. Tormented by fears and stress, conflicts gradually began to arise in her environment. A friend with whom she had once been close made it clear that she could no longer support her due to pressure from her own family, who considered Nia proof of failure. One day, after a long day, Nia returned home to find that her apartment had been burglarized. This was no random crime. Racial slurs had been scrawled on the walls, everywhere that could be written on. It was a clear attempt to intimidate her into leaving, proof that her troubles were not just personal, but part of a larger pattern of hatred and intolerance. These events left Nia on the brink of complete isolation. Every effort she made to clear her name and reclaim some measure of normalcy was met with new obstacles. She discovered that her racial identity now defined not only her personal struggles, but also how society as a whole responded to her presence. Every step she took reminded her that she was not just a person fighting for justice, but a symbol onto which all the fears and prejudices of others were projected. As she struggled to cope with the aftermath of these attacks, her inner world continued to crumble. Nia became increasingly withdrawn, in a constant battle for her identity and sanity. Her struggle not only with racism but also with societal stereotypes seemed endless, with each day bringing new challenges and new evidence of deep racial injustice. sank deeper into darkness. She realized that her own strength was dwindling. Living in constant fear and isolation left her on the brink of emotional collapse. One day, unable to bear the strain, she made a decision that seemed like her last chance to restore her life and her sense of justice. Nia decided to contact a lawyer to sue those who had persecuted and slandered her. However, even this decision proved burdensome and difficult. When Nia began looking for a lawyer, she found that many of those who had previously offered to help now refused to represent her. Some lawyers she contacted directly told her that her case was too risky, that it could negatively affect their reputation. Others avoided her, despite her tenacity and persistence, preferring to remain on the sidelines of such a sensitive and controversial issue. Finally, she found a lawyer who agreed to take on her case, but, as it soon became clear, his help was far from ideal. His approach was superficial and he did not show the necessary enthusiasm that would ensure a fair trial. This lawyer did not believe in her fairness and insisted on making a deal, despite her desire to fight for the truth. This decision only strengthened her conviction that the justice system from which she expected support, in fact, continued to fail her. When the trial began, Nia faced new challenges. The defense presented by her opponents included tactics aimed at discrediting her character. They used old allegations and manipulated public opinion to create an image of Nia as an inadequate and problematic person. At the trial, her lawyer failed to properly refute these allegations, and this only made her situation worse. The onslaught of attacks she faced in the courtroom was a real challenge. Every day, she saw her case and her personal suffering become part of a public spectacle. News and social media only fueled interest in her situation, creating and maintaining new versions and sensations. Nia couldn't shake the feeling that her personal tragedy was being used as a spectacle for entertainment and censure, rather than as a catalyst for change and discussion. Meanwhile, her financial situation became even more critical. All the legal fees, court costs, and recovery from the attacks were a significant burden. Nia saw her bank account rapidly drain and her debts mounting. She also had difficulty finding work, with each new interview ending in rejection when potential employers learned of her legal battles and scandalous reputation. No matter how hard Nia tried to hold on, her health began to suffer. The stress and constant pressure began to take a toll on her physical condition. Doctors diagnosed her with symptoms of chronic stress and anxiety disorder, requiring medication. The medications helped only partially, and the constant feeling of anxiety and loneliness continued to haunt her. One night, when Nia woke up from another nightmare, the thought occurred to her that perhaps her fight for justice had become too much for her to bear. The time spent fighting had led to a deep internal crisis. Nia asked herself, could her efforts really change anything in a system that seemed so resistant to change? This doubt, woven into her heart, only deepened her isolation. She felt not only a victim of racism, but also the biggest victim of a system in which she had no place. Nia realized that her fight not only for the truth, but for her own identity and place in this world, was becoming increasingly difficult and intractable. Finally, in the face of continued hardship, she made the decision to focus on her own recovery. Nia began seeking support in self-help groups and therapeutic communities, hoping to find comfort and understanding among those who had experienced similar experiences. She realized that her personal recovery and restoration might be just as important as her fight for justice. However, as Nia began to re-enter the healing process, it was clear to her that her life had been forever changed. The systemic racism she had experienced had left deep and painful scars. In her fight for justice, she was forced to confront a reality that was far more complex and brutal than she could have ever imagined. Nia was determined to continue her fight, despite the odds. Each court hearing was a test of her patience and resilience. The courtroom was charged with tension. The judge who had previously humiliated her so easily now acted with even greater bias. Nia began to understand that her case was not only personal, but also symbolic. It was part of a larger fight for equality and justice that was, in reality, trapped by systemic biases. At first, Nia and her lawyer tried to counter the defense's arguments. The defense, which represented the opponents, used sophisticated legal tricks and manipulations. They aggravated public opinion against Nia, portraying her as a rebel who was trying to use racism as a cover for her personal failures. Their tactic was to blame her for starting the conflict, rather than racial bias causing her problems. At one point during a trial, Nia witnessed a defense attorney lash out at her in a brutal cross-examination. He tried to paint her as a troublemaker, accusing her of provocation and violating professional ethics. The attorney's questions bordered on insulting and humiliating. Nia, although emotionally exhausted, managed to keep her cool. She answered the questions, trying not to show her vulnerability, but she felt her inner world being torn apart. The public attention surrounding her case only made things worse. Media reports often distorted the facts, exaggerated details, and missed key moments that would have shown her in a more positive light. Nia was often portrayed as an aggressive and emotionally unstable figure, which only reinforced the biases of viewers and those following the trial. The photos and videos that were published were carefully selected to highlight her weaknesses and create a negative image. The trial was a real test of her endurance. In the courtroom, Nia saw racial bias permeate every aspect of the trial. When she testified, her words were often distorted or even ignored. The judge, as if following informal instructions, supported every defense motion, even when it was clearly intended to discredit Nia. Witnesses who could have supported her case were dismissed or questioned in part because of their race or status in society. Moreover, Nia faced additional challenges related to racial bias. During one trial, she had to deal with a jury that was clearly biased against her. The testimony and arguments presented by her lawyer had no impact, and many of the jurors showed their disinterest and bias. Nia could see the bias and hostility in their views, which only added to her feeling of powerlessness. Each court hearing, each new charge, and each new round of slander only added to her pain and frustration. But even more painfully, Nia realized that her personal suffering was part of a larger system of racial discrimination that continued to exist and thrive. Her case became a reflection of how racism permeated the justice system and how difficult it is to combat. One day, as Nia sat in her office, her surroundings were filled with the latest news about her case. Newspapers ran articles suggesting that her attempts to seek justice were nothing more than an act of revenge. Reports discussed her personal failings, attempting to tie them to her race, as if it were a natural extension of her struggle. Every new headline, every new social media post was a reflection of how deeply ingrained racism was in society. This stage of the trial was particularly challenging for Nia. She had to face how her personal experiences and suffering were taken out of context and used against her. A deep sense of betrayal and injustice continued to gnaw at her, and despite her inner resilience, Nia often found herself lost in her thoughts, filled with doubt and pain. Every day Nia faced new obstacles. Every court hearing brought new frustrations. She realized that her fight for justice was not just a fight against a specific case, but against the systemic biases that permeated the entire justice system. This fight, despite her endless predicament, left her wondering if she would ever be able to achieve justice in a system that seemed to have already determined her fate. As the trial dragged on, Nia became increasingly aware that her fight was beyond the ordinary confines of a courtroom. She was drawn into a darkness where her personal suffering and justice were intertwined with social injustice and systemic racism. The courtroom became an arena for a drama that centered on Nia, trapped in bias and discrimination. With each passing hearing, her lawyer, though inexperienced, became increasingly ineffective. His weak defense and frequent ignoring of key arguments meant that the charges against Nia became increasingly compelling to the court. The lack of proper preparation and strategic planning only reinforced the biases in the system and allowed the defense to paint Nia in a highly unfavorable light. Her trial attracted the attention of local and national media, but their interest in the case was far from benevolent. Every new discussion, every article, and every report only added fuel to the fire. Journalists actively supported the idea that Nia was guilty of creating conflict and trying to use racism as a cover for her failures. Their publications often contained unverified facts and exaggerations, which created a public opinion completely opposed to Nia. One of the most devastating blows to Nia came from an unexpected quarter. In the courtroom, her mother, whom she had always turned to for moral support, was suddenly subjected to public condemnation. Several vicious comments in the press and on social media directed hatred at her family, accusing her mother of allegedly encouraging Nia to create scandals and supporting her rebellion. These attacks on those close to Nia deeply hurt her and only increased her feelings of isolation. Over time, Nia noticed that her problems were getting worse not only in the legal sphere, but also in her personal life. Her financial situation had reached a critical point. The costs of legal fees and a lawyer led to her debts increasing significantly. She was forced to sell her apartment and move to less comfortable housing. In parallel, her old bills and loans began to accumulate, and creditors began to persistently remind her of themselves. The work and professional opportunities she once had disappeared. Nia tried to return to practice, but her attempts to find clients or receive job offers were met with stiff resistance. The system that once offered her the opportunity to work now closed its doors, forcing her to realize that her past accomplishments were being overshadowed by her current situation. Even when she was able to find part-time jobs, they were low-paying and not in line with her skills. Nia had once associated with began to avoid her. Those who had once been her colleagues now expressed latent or overt resentment at being associated with her. Many of them avoided getting involved with her case, fearing that it would negatively affect their own careers and reputations. As a result, Nia found herself almost completely alone, and her internal sense of isolation became even more acute. Every morning, Nia woke up feeling like her life was getting worse. With the ongoing court cases and her mounting personal and financial difficulties, she began to experience symptoms of clinical depression. The psychological burden she was carrying was unbearable, and each day brought new challenges. She responded to even the most basic questions about the future with despondency and hopelessness. Nia's internal state continued to deteriorate, and she began to question the very idea of justice. Her decision to continue fighting became increasingly difficult. However, every time she thought about giving up, the memories of how she had been humiliated and wrongfully judged returned to her with even greater force. Her cases and struggles were a reflection of the systemic racism that permeates not only the judicial system, but every aspect of society. Racial bias not only defined her experience, but also intensified her suffering, making her fight for justice an unimaginably difficult and painful process. Nia remained on the edge, and every attempt to regain her dignity and place in society was met with further bias and discrimination. As her personal circumstances worsened, her fight for the truth became more and more difficult. At every turn, Nia was confronted with new evidence that racism and prejudice permeated society, and her attempts to change the situation were met with insurmountable obstacles. In her life and in the trial, the struggle continued, filled with fear, betrayal, and constant pressure that only increased her sense of helplessness. Nia faced the toughest choice of her life. Despite her tenacity and determination, each new trial only increased the burden she had to bear. The trial became an arena where her personal suffering was made a subject of debate, and the racial prejudices exacerbated by her case took on increasingly sinister forms. At the next court hearing, another blow occurred. The defense attorney presented unexpected evidence, incriminating letters that they claimed proved Nia was involved in illegal financial schemes. These letters, which Nia had never seen before, were presented as irrefutable evidence of her fraudulent activities. Despite the fact that Nia and her attorney claimed that the letters were forgeries, the judge, who had already proven himself to be clearly biased, admitted them as evidence. This decision was another blow to her reputation and called into question her professional and personal integrity. The investigation that followed the release of these emails only made matters worse. More allegations followed, as her former clients began filing lawsuits alleging that Nia had engaged in unethical practices. Many of these allegations were patently false, but they only added fuel to the fire and threatened to destroy her career entirely. Her financial problems also continued to mount. As the situation worsened, she was forced to take out a loan to pay her legal fees, and soon her debts became unmanageable. Collectors and creditors began filling her mailbox, and calls about unpaid debts became frequent and aggressive. Her credit rating was destroyed, and she saw her financial situation spiraling into abyss. The endless bills and debts began to threaten her life and even her health. Nia tried to find temporary work to support herself, but she found it increasingly difficult. With her reputation damaged, employers avoided her, fearing association with her case. Her resume had a black mark that made it difficult to get even low-paying jobs. Nia applied for many positions, but was rejected each time. Even those who had previously been willing to help now refused to support her, fearing reputational repercussions. Nia's personal life was also under threat. Internal conflicts began to occur in her environment, and her relationships with loved ones became strained. Friends and acquaintances who had previously supported her began to distance themselves, avoiding communication and participation in her case. She felt completely alone. The constant pressure and public condemnation caused emotional and mental exhaustion. Her mental health problems also worsened. Nia began to suffer from severe depression and anxiety. Nightmares became part of her daily life, and her fears began to take over her mind. Counseling and medication only partially alleviated her suffering, and her feelings of anxiety and worry became increasingly tormenting. At this point, new rumors began to circulate in the media, claiming that Nia was using her position to manipulate the court and portray herself as a victim. These rumors, based on distorted data and exaggerated facts, only increased the pressure on Nia. Social media was filled with vicious comments, accusing her of trying to exploit racism to achieve her goals. The trial that was supposed to give her a chance at justice became a place of constant humiliation and abuse. Each hearing added to her suffering, as she became the target of public condemnation and judicial pressure. Nia saw her case turning into an endless ordeal that was destroying her personal and professional life, and she began to doubt that she would ever get justice. Her fight for truth and justice became not just a fight for recognition of her rights, but for her own existence. Nia felt that her life had become darkly intertwined with a system that used her as an example to demonstrate its power and bias. With each passing day, her situation became more desperate, and a feeling of helplessness overwhelmed her. She continued to live on the edge, and every day became a new test of her physical and mental endurance. Nia was on the brink of despair, and it was difficult for her to find sources of hope. But despite all the difficulties, deep down she continued to believe in the possibility of justice. Even when her path to truth and justice seemed closed and irreparable, Nia still looked for a way to survive and fight despite everything she had to endure. As her life continued to turn into a living nightmare, Nia remained in search of ways to preserve her human dignity and hoped that her long-awaited justice would finally be achieved. As the court hearings continued, Nia increasingly felt her personal and professional problems intertwining with her legal case. The gravity of the situation she found herself in became increasingly unbearable, and her inner world seemed to be falling apart. Nia faced new challenges when her lawyer was unable to cope with the growing number of allegations and legal manipulations directed against her. The defense attorney continued to use all possible means to discredit Nia, and a new weapon appeared in his arsenal: personal photos and videos that were taken out of context and distorted. These materials were presented as evidence of her angeliture, inadequacy, and unreliability. The media immediately picked up on this information, and public opinion moved further away from Nia. Her financial situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. The debt collectors to whom her debts had been transferred began active collection efforts. Aggressive calls, visits, and threats became part of her daily life. Every new day, Nia faced new demands and ultimatums that only worsened her financial crisis. She was forced to seek out charities and social services for help, but many of them stated that her situation was too complex and confusing for them to solve. The situation on the personal front also continued to deteriorate. Friends and acquaintances who were once close to her began to avoid her because of her heightened reputation. She found herself isolated, deprived of the support and help that would have been vital during this difficult period. Psychological counseling and therapy, although they helped her partially, could not eliminate the deep sense of loneliness and betrayal that Nia experienced every day. Each court hearing was a real test. The judge, who had already shown obvious bias, continued to steer the case in an unfavorable direction for Nia. With each new hearing, his bias became more obvious, and he openly supported the defense. Despite its controversial arguments and accusations, Nia often became a victim of public insults and humiliations, which were carried out under the guise of a legal trial. The trial continued to be a public spectacle. Media reports that increasingly distorted the facts only fueled public opinion against Nia. She became the subject of discussions on social media, where she was accused of manipulation and fraud. Even when she tried to present her side of the story, her words and arguments were twisted and used against her. Nia began to realize that her personal ordeal was part of a much larger problem involving racism and bias in society. Her attempts to find new sources of income or employment opportunities were constantly thwarted. Every resume she submitted, every attempt to get a job, became a futile attempt when potential employers learned of her legal problems. With the constant public stigma and financial crisis, Nia felt increasingly helpless. There came a stage in her life where every new event seemed to add to her endless suffering. Nia continued to fight, despite the constant feeling that her efforts were only leading to more destruction. She was exhausted, but still looking for ways to preserve her human dignity and find a way out of the dark tunnel she was trapped in. Nia woke up every morning with a sense of uncertainty and fear. Her attempts to find peace and justice were met with constant resistance. The trial was not only a test of her patience, but also a constant reminder of how deep and complex racism is in society. Each new day brought new challenges, and her life continued to teeter on the brink of total destruction. The challenges Nia faced continued to mount, but despite everything, she never lost hope. Nia continued to fight for her rights, for her life, and for justice. Even when everyone around her seemed to be against her, she looked for ways to rebuild her life and make her voice heard and accepted. With every step her path became more difficult and full of obstacles, but Nia remained determined despite all the hardships and difficulties she had to face. As Nia continued her fight in court, the situation became increasingly critical. Each new hearing brought new challenges, and public pressure only increased. The trial became not only an arena for legal conflict, but also a battlefield for her personal and professional life. Despite his best efforts, her lawyer was unable to cope with the mounting allegations and legal maneuvers. The defense attorney, who brazenly used every possible method to discredit Nia, continued to paint her in an extremely negative light. Not only did he introduce falsified evidence to the court, but he also challenged her every argument, ignoring the real facts and focusing on her personal shortcomings. In response, Nia and her lawyer tried to find evidence and witnesses that could refute the allegations, but their efforts were often in vain. At the same time, Nia's financial situation reached a critical point. Collectors became even more aggressive in their attempts to collect debts. Nia was forced to sell the remaining personal belongings to cover at least part of her debts. Every week, new letters and calls from creditors only added to her stress. The amount of debt continued to grow, and Nia felt that her financial situation was simply slipping out of control. Her health, both physical and mental, began to rapidly deteriorate. Doctors diagnosed her with chronic stress and anxiety disorder, which required long-term treatment and meditation. Nia continued to take medication, but it was insufficient. Her nights were filled with insomnia and nightmares that plagued her every time she tried to find some peace. Additionally, her personal life continued to fall apart. She began to notice that her close relationships with friends and family were strained. Friends who had previously supported her began to avoid her out of fear of social stigma. Her family, while emotionally supportive, could not fully understand her suffering and the depth of isolation she was facing. Nia felt that even those who were close to her were now part of a system that had betrayed her. The problems at work also continued to mount. Hundreds of rejections from potential employers continued to pour in, and every time Nia tried to find temporary work, her legal problems and biases became obstacles. Even job offers that once might have been suitable were now unavailable due to her reputation. Nia became almost unemployed, which worsened her financial and personal problems. In the courts, her fight became increasingly desperate. New witnesses came forward to testify against her, and each time their words increased public pressure and created even greater bias against Nia. Her lawyer, under pressure from all sides, often looked confused and ineffective. Nia was forced to build her defense under constant stress and a lack of resources. The trial turned into a public spectacle, with Nia being the target of constant attacks. The media and social media were filled with new rumors and accusations that only reinforced her position as a victim. With each passing day, her case became more complex, and Nia felt as if her life and struggle were being staged for public spectacle. Amid these challenges, Nia continued to search for a way out. She tried to reach out to human rights organizations and actively sought support from lawyers who specialized in racial discrimination cases. Despite her efforts, Nia was constantly rejected or ignored. Organizations that could have offered assistance were often overwhelmed or lacked the resources to intervene in her case. Each day became more and more unbearable, and Nia felt her mental and physical condition continue to deteriorate. Despite all this, deep down she kept the hope that she could still get justice and rebuild her life. Every morning, when she woke up, she faced a new day filled with difficulties, but her determination did not fade. Nia continued to fight despite the increasing pressure she had to face. Her fight for truth and justice continued, but it was now more than just a legal matter. It was a personal drama, a reflection of the deep systemic injustice and racial bias that manifested itself in every aspect of her life. Nia could find no peace or relief, but her inner fire continued to burn despite the endless trials she endured. After the trial in which Nia found herself in the spotlight reached its climax, the life of the judge, Mr. James Warren, began to change. Warren was an older, respected judge who had been on the bench for many years and was known for his strict but impartial approach to cases. However, the scandal that arose around the Nia case cast doubt on his reputation and caused significant changes in his life. At first, Warren was confident in his immunity. He continued to conduct his affairs, believing that public interest in Nia's case would soon fade. However, as the situation progressed, pressure began to be brought to bear on him from all sides. Public opinion, fueled by the media and activists, demanded justice and accountability for his bias. His decision and actions regarding Nia began to draw attention to both specific court decisions and his personal professional practice. One by one, allegations of bias and ethical violations began to surface. At first, these were just rumors and claims in the press, but then the case took a more serious turn. New evidence and testimony emerged that indicated that Warren had not only been biased in the Nia case, but had violated court procedures in other cases. These allegations became the basis for an open investigation. In response to public pressure and the mounting number of lawsuits, the government began a formal investigation into Warren's activities. A special committee of high-profile legal experts and experts was created to conduct an independent investigation into his work. The committee's work attracted both public and media attention. During the investigation, Warren found himself at the center of public condemnation. The media eagerly covered every new development in his case, and his name became synonymous with bias and corruption. Journalists followed his every move, and many articles were devoted to how Warren had lost his reputation and been embroiled in scandal. In response to the pressure, Warren was forced to resign from his position. The resignation was framed as health reasons, which was, of course, a cover story to avoid directly admitting guilt. But even after his resignation, Warren could not escape the public spotlight. He faced lawsuits and demands for damages from both individuals and various organizations. A new wave of criticism hit him after it emerged that he had accepted gifts and bribes from those with interests in his court decisions. The allegations confirmed that his behavior went beyond mere bias and showed signs of systemic corruption. His life became a series of lawsuits and financial problems. Mentally, Warren began to experience serious difficulties. Accompanied by constant public condemnation and personal problems, his health began to deteriorate rapidly. He suffered from chronic stress, and his life became filled with fear and anxiety. He was forced to seek professional help, but many specialists noted that his condition was so deep and neglected that recovery was extremely difficult. His personal life also suffered. His previously supportive wife began to drift away. Their family relationships became strained, and soon Warren and his wife decided to divorce. The social connections he had also began to crumble. Friends and colleagues began to avoid him, fearing that his problems could negatively affect their own reputations. Warren also faced financial difficulties. The costs of litigation, fines and compensation became significant. His financial assets began to rapidly dry up, and soon he found himself in a difficult situation where he could not cover even the most basic expenses. Gradually, after a year of public pressure and personal failures, Warren retreated into complete seclusion. He spent several months in isolation, living in a rented apartment in another city, far from his old life and familiar surroundings. His attempts to return to normal life were futile, and he realized that his career and reputation were completely destroyed. This new life of isolation and constant financial pressure completely changed his perception of the world and life. Warren, who was once a symbol of law and order, found himself in complete opposition to the previous status he occupied. His story became a lesson in the importance of maintaining impartiality and ethical purity in any field, especially in justice, and how easily everything can be lost if bias and corruption become the basis of action. the events surrounding Warren served as a serious warning to other judges and justice officials. His tragic story served as a reminder that fairness and ethics must be the foundation of all judicial decisions, and that bias and corruption can have devastating consequences for both the individual and the justice system. James Warren's life continued to descend into deep darkness as he faced the consequences of his actions. After resigning and going into seclusion, his life took several painful and unexpected turns. Warren moved to a small apartment in a quiet suburb, trying to escape the public eye. His new place was modest and a far cry from his former lavish lifestyle. The relationship with his ex-wife became even more strained, and the divorce, although not public, took a strong emotional toll on him. His ex-wife, suffering from stress and public pressure, insisted on a division of property and alimony, which added to his financial problems. In his new environment, Warren found himself largely isolated from society. His old network of contacts and friends faded into the background, many of whom had already distanced themselves from him because of his public disgrace. Even his colleagues who had once been close now avoided contact, believing that supporting the former judge would damage their own reputations. Warren faced a number of legal and financial difficulties. The enormous legal costs associated with his case left him with significant financial obligations. With mounting debts and a lack of funds, he was forced to sell his remaining assets, including his real estate and some personal belongings, to at least partially cover his debts. The dwindling financial reserves became a constant source of stress, and Warren often found himself in despair as he tried to find ways to survive in the new circumstances. Warren's psychological condition worsened with each passing day. The psychotherapy and medications he took failed to improve his condition significantly. He became obsessed with the idea of his downfall, reliving every detail of his case and accusations. The psychological counseling he sought only partially helped him cope with his inner demons, and many specialists noted that his condition was serious and required complex treatment. Public condemnation and guilt became the main parts of his daily life. Warren often thought about his actions and mistakes, and this brought him deep emotional pain. His reflections on his own behavior and mistakes made his solitude even more difficult. He could not find inner peace and forgiveness for his misdeeds. Attempts to restore his professional reputation and return to public life were futile. Every time he tried to establish some activity or find a new occupation, his reputation became an obstacle. He sought help from various professional societies and organizations, but his past always remained on the surface, creating obstacles to a new professional career. The job market was unfriendly, and Warren faced numerous rejections and ignorance. His daily life was filled with routine and boring tasks. Time passed slowly, and each day brought only an additional feeling of helplessness and isolation. Simple things, such as walking around the neighborhood or reading a book, seemed insignificant and meaningless to him, as he was consumed by his inner conflicts and frustrations. Family ties and personal relationships that had once been close to him also began to crumble. His relationships with his children and close relatives became strained. Although they tried to maintain contact, their interactions were marred by mistrust and constant reminders of the past. It was difficult for them to fully understand and accept what Warren was going through, and their relationships became less close and more formal. As time went on, Warren began to seek inner healing. He continued to search for ways to cope with the guilt and illness that had consumed his life. He would occasionally try to volunteer or help his local community, hoping to somehow atone for his mistakes. However, his efforts were largely ineffective, as he could not find satisfaction or forgiveness for his actions. His life continued to be filled with struggles for survival and internal conflict. His attempts at redemption and struggles with society's prejudices left deep wounds, and each new day brought new challenges. Despite his best efforts, Warren was never able to fully shake off the burden of his past, and his life remained in a constant state of instability and fear. All the while, Warren continued to be in the media spotlight, even if that attention became more modest and infrequent. Every time new news touched on his case, it reminded him of his fall and mistakes. These reminders only worsened his condition and added to his internal suffering. Despite all the difficulties, Warren never lost hope that he would one day find a path to forgiveness and redemption. His life, filled with suffering and struggle, remained in constant search for meaning and a way to right his wrongs. Deep down, he still hoped that he could find a way to deal with the consequences of his actions and rebuild his life, even if it meant changing a lot about himself. Nia West's life continued to turn into an endless stream of trials, with racism becoming a major factor influencing every aspect of her life. After the trial, her life was disrupted, but the real effects of racial discrimination that she had to face began to manifest themselves with renewed vigor. After Nia's case gained public attention, she found herself in the spotlight not only of the media, but also of civil society organizations, activists, and human rights defenders. The racism that had become apparent in the trial now permeated every part of her life. Even after the trials were over, Nia's fight for justice had only just begun. Despite the legal battle being over, Nia continued to face discrimination. Employers who might have offered her a job often rejected her once they learned of her legal troubles. Even when her resume showed qualifications and experience, racial bias and public opinion shaped by the media served as barriers. She found that her name and skin color became a red flag for many employers. A candidate who had already been the target of public censure was perceived as a potential threat to the company's reputation. Nia's financial situation became even more difficult. Her rapidly declining credit score, caused not only by legal fees but also by job rejections, meant that she began to have serious difficulties in obtaining credit and loans. The system that was supposed to support her in difficult times was now making her situation even worse. In some cases, banks and financial institutions rejected her applications, citing increased risk due to her reputation and race. Racism also affected her personal life. Neighborhoods and social groups she was involved with began to change their attitudes toward her. Some previously friendly neighbors began to avoid her, and her children became victims of teasing and bias at school. Nia found that racism permeated even everyday interactions, and this only increased her feelings of isolation and helplessness. Healthcare and psychological support were another area where racism had an impact. Nia found that access to quality healthcare was a challenge. She was given substandard care by many institutions, and had to deal with doctors who were biased, perceiving her as different because of her race. The psychological treatment she needed to cope with stress and anxiety often left her feeling frustrated and helpless, as professionals could not always understand or accept the specifics of her situation. Her attempts to find help from human rights organizations were not always successful either. Despite active work to combat racial discrimination, many organizations were overloaded and could not offer her timely and adequate assistance. Refusal of help from those who should have supported her only increased her feelings of loneliness and isolation. Gradually, Nia began to develop a sense of internal crisis. Internal frustration and constant exposure to systemic bias left her feeling helpless. Her previous dreams of career advancement and personal fulfillment began to seem unattainable. Nia struggled with depression and a sense of injustice, and her hopes for improvement gradually faded. The issues of racial bias even affected her desire for community service. Nia, who had once been an active member of the community and strived to improve the living conditions of others, now found her proposals and initiatives rejected. Even in community organizations where she tried to find support and help, racial bias often became a barrier to her participation and recognition. Nia's life continued to be filled with struggle and hardship. The racism she had experienced in the trial was not just part of her past, but a constant element of her present. Each new trial, each new failure, was a reminder of how deeply bias permeates public and private life. Despite all the difficulties, Nia continued to seek ways to overcome her problems and achieve justice. She never lost hope that her story and struggle would help raise awareness about racial discrimination and inspire others to take action. Nia remained determined to continue her personal and social struggle despite the endless difficulties and obstacles she continued to overcome. Nia West's life continued to be a difficult ordeal, and each new morning was another reminder of how difficult it was for her to cope with the effects of racism. Despite the deep disappointment and constant hardships, Nia could not allow herself to give up, even though every day seemed like a fight for survival. Attempts to find regular employment remained unsuccessful, after failing to secure work with human rights organizations, which rejected her due to her connection to a high-profile court case. Nia began to consider less traditional avenues of income. She attempted to start her own business offering legal advice and assistance with human rights cases, but a lack of startup capital and a lack of trust from potential clients made this extremely difficult. The small financial successes she did achieve were often insufficient to cover her basic needs, and she was forced to take low-paying temporary jobs to make some marginal gains. Racial bias also manifested itself in everyday situations. Nia found that her social isolation had become even more acute. The local community that once offered her support and friendship now often avoided her, fearing that her negative reputation could affect their own situation. Even when she tried to form new connections and friendships, she faced prejudice and mistrust, which only increased her feelings of loneliness and isolation. Relationships with her family were also beginning to fray. Nia, who had been trying to maintain harmony with her loved ones, found that her constant financial and emotional problems were beginning to take a toll on her family. Her children, who had grown up with constant stress and uncertainty, were being bullied at school, and her previously supportive husband was becoming distant. The debt and financial difficulties she was facing were also putting pressure on her relationships, which were becoming more strained with each passing day. The psychological help Nia received was not always effective. Despite regular sessions with a therapist, she often had to deal with a lack of understanding and support. Many of the professionals she contacted could not fully understand her situation and experiences, which made the treatment process even more difficult. The many hours spent seeking psychological help only confirmed that racial bias and bias towards her personal history remained significant barriers to receiving adequate support. Nia also tried to use social media and the media to draw attention to her situation and issues of racial discrimination. She actively participated in public events, wrote articles, and shared her story in the hopes that it would help draw attention to her case and to issues of racism in general. However, despite her efforts, the response was mixed. Many of her online interactions were both supportive and aggressive, and often her messages and posts were met with a wave of outrage and bias. Her active participation in social media also led to more threats and negative comments. At times, her posts became the target of hate and insults, which only worsened her emotional state. While some of the public expressed support and understanding, others did not miss the opportunity to express their biased opinions and condemnation. These attacks further reinforced her feelings of isolation and helplessness. At the same time, Nia continued to look for ways to improve her situation and change the perception of racial discrimination in society. She stepped up her efforts in education and outreach, organizing lectures and events on the topics of equality and justice. In her quest to contribute to change, she also collaborated with human rights organizations that supported her efforts and tried to help her in her mission. However, the constant difficulties and problems were not only external, but also internal. Nia continued to struggle with the feelings of anger and betrayal that haunted her, and her fight for justice was largely a fight with internal demons. Each new trial and failure only increased her internal tension, and she was forced to find ways to cope with these emotions in order to continue her fight. Overall, Nia West's life was filled with endless trials that were the result of systemic racial discrimination. Despite her best efforts and fight for justice, racism continued to have a significant impact on her life, creating constant obstacles and barriers. Her story became increasingly complex and multifaceted, and each day brought new challenges and difficulties. Nia continued to fight, hoping that her efforts and resilience would ultimately lead to change and improvement in her life and the lives of others facing similar challenges. Nia West continued to struggle with the multifaceted challenges that racism and bias brought to her life. Every day was filled with constant struggle, and her attempts to find stability and peace seemed endless. Her active participation in human rights events and public actions brought some positive changes, but also exacerbated her conflicts and attracted the attention of not only her allies but also her opponents. Her participation in these events allowed her to continue to draw attention to the problems of racial discrimination, but also made her a target for backlash and even threats. Some of her activists were attacked, and Nia was one of those who fell victim to these attacks. She began to have security issues in her life. Repeated threats and aggression from racist people threatened her personal safety. Strange messages and anonymous threats began appearing in her home, and she had to take measures to ensure her safety and the safety of her family. She hired private detectives and security, but the constant feeling of being threatened and fear for the future became an integral part of her life. Nia's financial situation continued to be precarious. Although she received small grants and donations for her activities, it was not enough to cover all her needs and debts. Creditors began making demands, and she was forced to make difficult decisions to cope with the financial pressure. Even attempts to restructure her debts and negotiate installments often ended in failure, as her reputation and financial instability created additional obstacles. Nia's psychological state also continued to deteriorate. Constant stress caused by financial difficulties, threats and social pressure led to the development of anxiety disorders and depression. Her sessions with a psychologist became even more frequent, but they often proved insufficient for full recovery. Nia found solace only in her activities, despite the fact that these activities often brought new challenges and difficulties. One of the most painful aspects of her life was that her children continued to face racial bias and discrimination at school. They were teased and bullied, which only increased Nia's stress and feelings of powerlessness. Although she tried to address these issues through her school and local communities, her efforts were often met with barriers and resistance. The desire to protect her children and provide them with a better life free from bias became one of her top priorities, but also a source of constant struggle and frustration. Nia also faced difficulties in trying to establish social connections and re-establish her position in society. She found that her efforts to create new circles of friends and professional contacts were often blocked by prejudice and mistrust. Many of her potential friends and colleagues had difficulty overcoming the negative image that was attached to her name, which further reinforced her feelings of isolation. Her activism continued to attract attention and support from some groups, but it also created new challenges. Some of the advocacy groups she worked with experienced internal divisions and bureaucratic difficulties, making it difficult to collaborate effectively. Nia found that sometimes even among those who were willing to support her, there were hidden biases and issues related to her race. At the same time, Nia tried to find ways to ensure that her fight for justice and equality was not in vain. She continued to work on educational projects and community initiatives aimed at raising awareness of racial discrimination and helping others who were facing similar issues. Despite all the difficulties, she remained dedicated to her mission and hoped that her efforts would ultimately lead to positive changes in society. However, her personal situation remained complex and uncertain. Nia continued to face challenges that seemed almost insurmountable, and her life was filled with constant struggle and a desire to cope with the effects of racial bias. Despite all her efforts and resilience, she continued to be a victim of a system that rarely admits its mistakes and rarely changes in response to the struggles of individuals. Every new day was a challenge for Nia, and her life's journey continued to be full of hardships and trials. She fought for a better future for herself and her children, and every step she took in that fight was filled with hope for justice and change. While her personal life remained in a constant state of instability and struggle, her determination and resilience became a source of inspiration and strength for those who watched her story and supported her in this difficult struggle. Nia West, a black attorney who faced systemic racism, found ways to cope with discrimination despite the constant challenges. Knowing that her fight against racism would not end quickly, she actively participated in community and advocacy efforts. This included attending rallies, lectures, and discussions aimed at raising awareness about racial discrimination and combating bias. Not only did these actions help her stay active, but they also brought attention to her cause, keeping her morale up and helping others who were facing similar challenges. Understanding that collective efforts are key to combating racism, Nia sought support from allies, both among friends, colleagues, and human rights organizations. These allies provided her with material and moral support, helping her cope with difficulties and creating space for her activism. To protect her rights and emotional health, Nia sought legal and psychological help. Professional legal help was necessary to address specific issues related to racial discrimination, and psychological support helped her cope with the emotional and psychological consequences of bias. Regular sessions with psychotherapists became an important part of her strategy, allowing her to work on overcoming stress and depression. Nia developed strategic approaches to minimize the impact of racial discrimination on her career and personal life. This included finding alternative ways to provide legal advice and building a network of contacts in the human rights community despite the barriers that arose. She actively developed her professional skills by participating in seminars, courses and training, which allowed her to build her reputation and remain relevant in her field. Collaboration with civil society and human rights organizations played a key role in her fight. These organizations helped her not only with resources and funding, but also in organizing events aimed at drawing attention to the problems of racial discrimination. Nia used her connections to create a platform that will allow her to share her experiences and draw attention to important issues. In her field, Nia has made significant strides, Legislative initiatives supported by her organization have begun to make real changes in the area of racial equality. She has become a key figure in creating new programs aimed at reducing discrimination in and outside the legal system. These accomplishments have not only raised her profile, but also strengthened her belief that her work matters. Although her personal life and career continued to be full of challenges, Nia felt that her efforts were beginning to bear fruit. Her story served as an inspiration to many, and her ongoing fight against racism had a real impact on social and legal structures. Ultimately, Nia West became a symbol not only of resilience, but also of change. Her journey was difficult and full of challenges, but she learned to use these challenges as a platform for activism and change. With each step, she came closer to her goal of creating a society free of racial discrimination and bias, where justice and equality become a reality for all. Over the years of struggle, Nia West has seen her efforts begin to yield real results. Her activism and resilience have made her a recognized figure in the human rights field, and she has become a symbol of change for many people facing racial discrimination. Her organization had significant success in pushing for legislation to reduce racial bias in the legal system. The programs she helped create began to bear fruit, improving conditions for those who had previously faced systemic discrimination. Nia was energized by seeing her ideas and projects begin to change people's lives for the better. Nia's family life also changed. Her children, thanks to new educational opportunities and support, began to overcome the difficulties associated with racial discrimination. Gradually, the relationship with her husband improved, and the family regained harmony, supporting each other in difficult times. Although Nia continued to face challenges, her life took on new meaning. Her work, her efforts, and her victories became an important part of her legacy. She continued to share her knowledge and experience with others, training a new generation of activists and human rights defenders. Ultimately, Nia West not only achieved significant success in her professional life, but also created a solid foundation for further change in society. Her life and work became a testament to the fact that even in the most difficult circumstances, paths to justice and equality can be found. Nia knew that her path was full of difficulties, but every achievement, every changed opinion, every supported initiative became part of her great cause. And so, her story ends not as a fairy tale with a happy ending, but as an inspiring tale of resilience and determination. Nia West continued to be a symbol of the fight for justice, and her legacy was left not only in her actions, but also in the hearts of those she inspired and supported. Her journey was not easy, but it was full of significant achievements and left a deep mark on the quest for equality and justice. Nia West finally reached a point where her efforts became a symbol of change. Despite many challenges and systemic barriers, her persistence and determination led to significant changes. Laws supported by her organization began to take effect, improving conditions for many who had faced racial discrimination. The programs she initiated continued to benefit society, bringing elements of equality and justice to various areas of life. Her family regained harmony, and Nia's children, freed from some of the prejudice, began to confidently move forward in their lives. The relationship with her husband also improved, becoming a symbol of stability and support. Nia West left a deep mark on the social and human rights scene. Her work inspired many, and her efforts became the foundation for further change. She entered a period of satisfaction with what she had achieved and hope for the future. Nia's story ends as a testament to resilience and fortitude, demonstrating that even in the face of inequality and bias, change can be found. Her legacy will live on in those who are inspired by her example and in those who continue to work to create a more just and equal society. Your opinion on our story is important to us. We want to know how you perceive the story of Nia West, her struggles and achievements. Have you ever encountered similar situations in your life? What are your thoughts on how to combat bias and racism? We value each of our viewers and are grateful for your support. By subscribing to our channel, you will be the first to learn about new stories and materials that we create. Your support helps us continue to cover important and relevant topics. If you have experiences or ideas that can help others, please share them in the comments. Your stories and advice can be a valuable resource for those facing similar challenges. Together, we can create a community that supports and inspires each other on the path to a better future. Thank you for being with us. Subscribe, stay in touch, and together we can do a lot to change for the better.